Okay, so I think the first thing I'd like to do is discuss your first discussion posts. And I think everybody did a really fantastic job. Make sure you read my feedback because it's not just general feedback. The first paragraph is for you personally, and it's my response to what you wrote. And then after the first paragraph, it's kind of a general my thoughts about the questions I asked. Maybe I want to focus in on something specific or give you my viewpoint on something. Um, but the first part, is a direct response to you as an individual and what you wrote. Um, so I think most people had the right length of response. I know that's a lot of typing. And but it's like 2 weeks worth of information instead of one. And because we're only 7 weeks, the normal semester is 15 weeks. So it is a lot of work. I understand that. The but the other thing is I think everybody did a great job with it. I think you covered most of the information. Um, Make sure that like one way I know that you watched all the videos and everything is that if you comment on some stories that I tell, because they're not like readily accessible. So, and also I'm curious about what your reaction is for some of and all my stories are about clients who have that specific diagnosis. Um, the I think the only thing that a lot of people missed was they had time to watch all the videos and my lectures and do the readings, but the only video they missed was that lecture on films on demand from the library. So if they missed anything, that was usually it. Um, the most important part of that, and I know that's a lot of segments in that lecture. Um, but you only had to watch the ones that I listed. But the most important segment is on differentiation. So, by differentiation of diagnosis, uh, and when you do your final paper, you should also include a discussion of differential diagnosis. Um, and differential diagnosis is when you have a few diagnoses that are really close in the criteria, and you have to decide, well, which one is it? Why is it, um, you know, schizoaffective rather than schizophrenic? Why is, what type of bipolar is it? So there's three subtypes of bipolar. Which type is it? And you have to kind of give an example of why it is one and not the other. And the answer is always, well, because it includes this criteria, or it does not include a criteria. And if it does include a criteria, give an example of what the client did to gain that criteria. So um, yeah, that's that's the main part of that lecture. It's not complicated, you know. Um, they do sell what's called diagnostic trees, and it's almost like one of those. Have you ever seen those things? Uh, if the answer is yes, go right. If the answer is no, go left. And then it takes you down in two different directions. And one diagnosis is yes, one diagnosis is no. And then they go to another criteria. And so you can buy these charts, and they're not that expensive, but it helps you to differentiate using the various criteria. Um, so that might be helpful. Uh, the the other thing, since we're talking about differential diagnosis, is start thinking about like a movie character or a character in a book, or a comic book character, uh, television character, a cartoon, some character that you'd like to use in your final paper as a client. So for example, every Disney princess has a diagnosis. Um, let's see what else. Every superhero probably has a diagnosis, especially Batman. The so I would just caution that there are movies about individuals with diagnoses, um, like Girl Interrupted. They have the wrong diagnosis for that character. So I would rather you pick a character that doesn't have a diagnosis in the movie, um, and or they don't list the diagnosis, you know. So like a lot of people pick the Joker, you know, which is kind of interesting. Um, but you know, you can pick your own diagnosis and just validate it, back it up with the criteria, you know. Um, and you can be funny, you can be creative. If you don't know the character's entire background, you can make it up. Um, you know, but usually there's enough there. Just don't pick a movie where the character already has a diagnosis, and some of them aren't really correct. So, um, let's see what else. Uh, okay. So I do want to kind of, and we're going to go over the entire paper next week. Next week's only week 4. You've got till week 7. That'll give you 3 weeks to write the paper. We're going to go over the paper step by step next week. I think that'll still give you plenty of time to write the paper. And but I do want to go over some of the things from last week. Then we'll talk about some things from this week. We'll see if you have any questions for either one. So um I did make the content live for week 3. But let's look at last week first. So there was the live recording of me in class, in case you missed class. We talked about on being sane in insane places, in class. We talked about session notes, RX pharmaceutical scribbles, content of a good record. I gave you the assessment example. Let's talk about, so we went over the outline of the assessment example, but as I was looking at one of the assessments where I'm working at the hospital, there are some new questions that were not included on that older one. And the primary one is, what is your gender identity? And so, but there are some ways I go about asking certain questions. So the first thing is, uh, if I'm open and accepting of whatever they say and I'm not making a big deal out of things, if I just ask a question like I ask every other question, like how old are you, what's your gender identity, you know, it's like uh I'm not going to be judgmental, or anything else. Sometimes, individuals say that they are exploring that area of their life and who they are, and that's fine too, you know? Uh, the, um, the other thing I wanted to say was, let's say, they are exploring that area of their life and, or, they, answer another question, but only partially or only give like a one-word answer or something like that. Just because you ask them a question on the assessment and they give you an answer, you don't have to stop there. You can do a follow-up question that's not typed on the paper. You can dig a little deeper and get more information and ask open-ended questions or say, can you tell me more about that? So you don't just have to stop with the question typed on the sheet. You can do follow-up, you can go deeper, you can ask open-ended questions. You can say, can you tell me about that? Can you tell me a story about that? What's that mean to you? How's that affect your life? What's the severity? Is it affecting your life negatively or positively? So, I think it's good to get as much information as possible. You don't just have to ask a question and move to the next question. The other thing is, I try to know the questions well enough that yes, I'll have the paper in front of me, but I'm also not going to sound like I'm reading the whole thing to the client. I want to have a conversation with the client, because the more relaxed we are in our dialogue, the more comfortable they're going to be sharing information. There's a couple of things I do that are a little nuanced. So there are questions that people do not feel comfortable answering. So if it has to do with drugs or alcohol or sexuality or something like that, people are not as comfortable talking about that, even if it is confidential. So I always ask in a way that assumes the answer is yes. Because if the answer is no, they're going to correct me. They're going to say, hey, I don't do drugs. So the way I ask that is I say, hey, when's the last time you smoked pot? Or when's the last time you used a drug? Or what's your drug of preference? Or how many beers do you drink on a Friday night? So it's like I'm asking with the assumption that they do, and it's okay to me. Because if they don't, they're going to tell me, oh, I don't drink, oh, I don't smoke pot. They're going to correct me. Or they're just going to answer, yeah, not a lot, once or twice a week or whatever. But it's the way of asking those things, like, do you have a significant other? No. How often do you have sex? How many partners do you have? All of these things are kind of assumptions, because if they don't, they're gonna like, I don't have sex, whatever. You're talking to a minor, maybe. So I think that, asking things is, it's kind of like matter of factly, you're not doing any disservice to the client. I'm not asking it in an offensive way, you know. And if they say, oh, I don't do that, I apologize. Oh, I'm sorry. I asked it that way. That's fine, you know. But I'm not going to judge them either way. Uh, so it's totally unconditional and non-judgmental when we ask these questions. But those are also questions you can ask some natural follow-ups. I mean, if you're curious about something, there's probably a reason. Trust your instincts, you know. So you're not going to ask them like personal stuff just because you want to know. You're going to ask them things that may affect them clinically. So, all right, I think those were the main things that I wanted to add. If we are talking about gender identity and human sexuality, um, some of the follow-ups might be, you know, uh, are they considering transition? Things like that. Um, are they uh, are they taking any medication like hormones, testosterone, things like that? That's important to know because all of those affect uh, you know, our mood and other things. So, all right. So the one thing I wanted to ask before we moved on was, so the assessment, there's three parts to the paper. I'm just kind of giving you highlights. Next week we'll go into detail. So the first thing, you pick your character. The second thing is you do an assessment with them and you write it up. So this is the first part of your paper. It's an assessment of, some character. And, you know, I think that right now is a good time to ask, do you have any questions about the assessment process? All right. Uh, so then let's move on to a better discussion. And I just want to see everybody on the screen. So sometimes I'll choose two videos that are at odds. So for example, the medicated child was kind of precautionary about prescribing medicine to children. But adult ADHD was very promising and showed how successful adults could be with medication and an ADHD diagnosis. So, we're hearing kind of two different sides to this diagnosis treatment. So I just want to qualify my disclaimer is that, hey, I believe there is ADHD, that the diagnosis is valid. It's just that, and I've diagnosed children with ADHD. I just haven't diagnosed that many. And I've also found a lot of misdiagnoses and removed the diagnosis of ADHD from children. So it kind of goes both ways in my experience. Sometimes I think they're misdiagnosed. Sometimes I actually give the diagnosis. It really just depends. And it doesn't only depend on symptomology and criteria. What it really depends on is the severity of those symptoms and criteria. How seriously does it affect the well-being of their daily lives? So, because most young children can fit enough criteria to meet that diagnosis. And however, it's more about the severity of the criteria. If they're really not able to be successful, then we might want to consider it. The second thing is, I really personally don't like prescribing medication unless there's therapy involved as well. I don't like prescribing medication alone. So I usually recommend, and it doesn't have to be like lifelong therapy, but there should be some therapy uh, along with medication, if for nothing else, to monitor side effects. So, and to judge, is this working? Is it better to try another medication? But most of the time, 80% of the time, medications prescribed, they leave, they don't see them again until they come back to the doctors. Most of it's prescribed by a family doctor, not a psychiatrist. So there's not a lot of follow-up with that. But so I would definitely say, severity and follow up regularly with some ongoing therapy as well, and monitor that medication, and then also add some some uh, some additional therapeutic help with, like, the stop and think program, or catching oneself and uh, examining consequences and deciding, well, is this a good decision or not before the child acts. So all of those things go well, because if they truly are ADHD, then before they had medication, they're probably not able to follow a CBT system like that, because it's hard for them to catch themselves and to refocus. But on medication, they might need to relearn that process, but they would be able to learn it then. All right, so let's hear both sides of the argument. What do you all think about those two videos? Did you find anything like surprising? Yeah.
Um, I've watched a medicated child before like this, so I was like familiar with it, but like I am just like so against medicating children like in general. Um, just because of the really bad like negative side effects that it could have, like just on brain chemistry alone. Like, but because like with ADHD specifically, it's like so many things that like like ADHD is like predominantly given to like men over women, adolescents, just because of the way men are when they're younger, right? Like, but I talked about in my post too, like any like adult in a new environment would like exhibit some sort of like at least like a good portion of ADHD like symptoms, because they're in a new environment, they're experiencing new things, and that's kind of just where children are in life. They're not familiar with a lot of things. They don't know how to act. Um, there's not really solid um, behavior in mind. You know what I mean? So like
They might be going through a life change.
exactly, there's just so many like confounding variables like in the situation that it's just like one like therapy like should be the max for children, unless like it's like these like you said, like obviously there's going to be some kids with ADHD and like it's going to be obvious, but like a lot of the time like you should just really err on the side of caution with children. And that's kind of just where I fell like in terms of watching both the videos. It's like it just comes down to like age and brain development.
Yeah.
Because then when they're adults, like you can be sure that like this isn't just some sort of um
So that's a good point. So why not just try therapy first?
exactly.
What's the harm?
Yeah.
See how it goes.
But you can also kind of gauge where the parents' values lie. It's like if they want a quick fix, they're just going to want medication. Like, and then you can be like, okay, this kid is probably just like misparented because of their values. Like it's bad to say, but like because they're acting out, they think they're ADHD, but they're just not parenting them right most of the time, probably. Like, but if they're like, okay, like let's do some therapy, like let's try to figure this out, then they're probably like, yeah, like there might actually be something going on here because they've tried a lot and they're like, okay, like let's go to the next step.
And the other thing is, like, when I was a kid, I had like 3 recesses, a lunch period. We had a lot of experiential activities. My kids, they sat in front of a desk for like 8 hours a day. They had like one break and lunch. I couldn't do it.
Yeah, they're squirming in their seats, and it's like,
I
of course they
couldn't do
will.
it now as an adult. Yeah, it's difficult. Online thoughts.
Yeah, so when I watch the unmedicated or the medicated child, I just felt really bad for the kids. I
Yeah.
think that's my biggest thing is I just couldn't kind of sit there and just watch them because it is such a huge thing. As for the adults, the videos on the adults. Uh, my girlfriend, her brother is extremely autistic, and so he really struggles with like money management. Like he has a job and he's able to be somewhat independent, but he has no financial literacy whatsoever. And so it makes it really difficult for him to like manage his finances. So seeing that like I'm gonna say foundation that actually helps people with like ADHD help manage their funds, I think is like a really good tool. And I don't think things like that are talked about enough. But I think that's just me in the world that I see versus like other people.
Yeah, definitely.
I feel like too, one of the biggest things of the medicated child video was how I forget what the kid's name was, but he had been diagnosed, I think ADHD, right? And he was put on other medications because he was developing like anxiety and stuff. So there was medications for that. So the parents were saying eventually he was on a plethora of medications for all these different basically side effects of the original medication, and it just spiraled. So that right there made me think that just like their development, what was like mentioned before, and then adding all these other medications, it just got too out of hand. So that's where I'm just like, therapy first, like what's the harm? Like try that first if you need more, or kind of what we talked about with the severity. Like if the severity is extreme, I think the one kid was like harming herself and like her parents at one point, like physical aggression and stuff.
Yeah.
That's pretty severe where like we don't want those behaviors. So maybe medication would help there in conjunction with therapy, but just like try the therapy first, It might not be for you, but try that before we medicate. There was something else too that stuck out to me. I lost it. It'll come back to me. When it does, I'll unmute.
Well, and the other child that was similar to the first one, and the first one ended up having like a permanent tick as a result of it. But the second one that was similar to that was that it was a girl who was very like lethargic, and they saw it on the news and they died, and the parents who had kids who were on a lot of medication went to the psychiatrist, and they said, hey, we'd like to reduce the amount of medication, and they left with more medication.
I remember the other thing I was going to say too. There was a point in that video where the doctor said that they weren't doing studies with children with medication because they were like weary of it and all these different concerns. But I'm like, you're basically doing the experiment in real time because you don't know the long-term effects yet. So that just like baffled me too.
Exactly, because okay, so there's an FDA loophole, and the loophole is that doctors are allowed to prescribe medication to children under 12 if they feel it's in the best interest of the client. So if they think that the medication can do more good than their current situation is harming them, they're allowed to prescribe without testing on the kids. That's the loophole. And a doctor is always going to say it's in the best interest of the child to prescribe. Yeah. What else?
I definitely agree with like what everyone else was saying about the medicated child because like when I was a teenager, I was put on like 3 different ADHD medications and I was put on like 4 or 5 different antidepressants and they were just trying stuff. Like there was really no evidence behind it. And a lot of the evidence now actually shows there's not as much of a correlation between serotonin levels and depression. So I feel like the fact that SSRIs were not helping showed that it was a more situational thing for me than it was like a clinical diagnosis of depression. And as soon as I got out of that situation, my symptoms subsided and therapy helped a lot. And so I don't know, I feel like when you're medicating kids and teens, a lot of the time there's some root problem with like maybe their home situation or like their life situation that isn't being addressed. And instead they're just being medicated for something that could be helped in therapy.
Yeah, that's an excellent point because, and any child would probably be symptomatic if they experienced serious environmental issues. not just that one child who experienced them. So in effect, it would be normal to display symptomology if children are experiencing severe environmental impacts. Yeah, good point. What else?
Sorry, one last thing popped into my head. Another thing that I thought about too is when the kids get older and say they don't want to be on this medication anymore, I feel like it'd be so hard for them to just learn the skills that they could have been learning from childhood instead of just given the medication. So like as they get older, they want to get off of it and now they don't have these skills. So I don't know. That just also like, I
Yeah,
don't know.
it's a perfect example, like, so usually when people stop taking medication is when they graduate high school. And they either get a job or have a family or go to college or some other school or the military. And that's when they stop taking it. But that's when they run into problems because they haven't learned. They're right back to where they started, but now they're 18. So then they can run into legal issues. And like acting out at 18 is very different than acting out at like 6. Yeah,
There's something else to say too.
yeah.
That kind of like sparked something in my head, like, because I was medicated when I was young, like for depression, and I had gotten off of it, like you said, like right after I graduated high school. I got back on it shortly after, but like it's just this weird stigma that like medication can like fix all your problems. Like it's really weird. Cause like, I was not going through a good time and my dad was like, Chris, like you need to get back on that medication. I was like, one, that won't fix it. And two, it's just like you said, like there's just so much like new stuff going on and so much that you're trying to work through that it's like, of course you're gonna be so stressed out, which can cause a lot of depressive symptoms or
Yeah.
GAD symptoms, stuff like that. Yeah,
Yeah.
I don't know. Medication's just weird in today's society. With how
Well,
it's out there.
Americans love magic pills.
They do.
So, the two things I'd like to add with any medication is that, so one of the first things I do is I try to take a child off of all medication and get a baseline, but that means the child has to be monitored because you might have to wean them off some medication. Because let's say a psychiatrist has, added medications before they'll take them off a medication, but put them right on a different one, or they'll add a second one. So they're really prescribing medication for an assessment of a child on a different medication. They're not getting a baseline of that child without any medication. So once this cycle starts, all of the diagnoses are for a child that's on a medication. So I was really happy to see that the first thing in this job at the hospital is the first thing they do is get a baseline. Because that's the first thing I always recommended. And it was always difficult to get that approved because it's like a 14-day period. You've got to take them off for an extended period of time. They've got to be monitored, even if it's by a parent or guardian, that's okay. As long as they're not a risk of suicide. And then then we have to re-diagnose, reassess, re-diagnose, and then try whatever they're going to try. So, I think that's really important, getting that baseline. Because a lot of times medications have been changed on and off, or different medications so much. And then Fritz wrote, yeah, Tylenol being dangerous was the most shocking. So if you think about it, there's the most dangerous over-the-counter thing you can buy is tobacco. Tobacco kills more people every year than every illegal drug combined. Just tobacco alone. And we're worried about the opioid epidemic, as we should be, but doesn't even come close to what tobacco does, and it's legal. Second drug that kills more people than all other illegal drugs combined is alcohol. And you know, and then one of the next things is acetaminophen. I don't know. So yeah, other than car crashes, so car safety. So yeah, it really is, it is interesting. All right, let's talk about a different one. What did you think? Did I tell the story about the woman being followed by men in black? What did you think about that one? That was a pretty good one. So, I think that a lot of times, delusions, I've often wondered, is this true? Is this not true? How do I know? How do I know if this is true or not? Unless, it's something extreme. And so there's video on schizophrenia, and there were videos on Tourette's. Now Tourette's is an interesting thing because and I might have said this in my class video, but Tourette's is like, if I say, no matter what you do, don't think about the blue monkey. Well, if you're trying not to think about the blue monkey, that's all you're thinking about. And that's what Tourette's is like. They're thinking about not swearing or not, making a noise or not getting up out of their seat. And the more they think about not doing it, the more pressure they feel to do it. So it has this inverse effect. And, how many of you have had an urge to get up and scream in the middle of a concert, or drive your car off a cliff? But you don't do it, but the urge is there. And there's a French word for this, but I have this symptom where if I'm on a high building, or if I'm hiking and I go up to the top of a mountain and I look over, I kind of want to jump off, not to hurt myself, and then I have a fear that whatever that part of my brain is that stops me from doing it, maybe it won't work. And someday I'll just do it just to see what it's like. But so it's this weird impulse.
Cult of the void, it's called.
The cult of the void, that's what it is. So yeah, but the most common isn't jumping. It's like while you're driving, and maybe I feel there's some weird feeling of driving into the other lane or driving off a cliff or something like that. It's usually driving. But yeah, so here's the thing with Tourette's. There are surgeons with Tourette's, and when they're focused and totally present in surgery, they're not thinking about anything else but surgery. and they lose whatever impulse they normally have. So when their mind is focused, they no longer have the Tourette's impulse. And so I had seen a documentary on this, and there was a child in an elementary school where I was working who had Tourette's, and the teacher would get so fed up with him like swearing in the middle of the class, but she would try to control him and have him control that. So that was a lot of pressure, him thinking about it. So, she'd send him down to my office, and, I had to get him used to it being a safe environment. I'm like, I don't care if you swear. I don't care if you yell. I don't care if you make noises. I don't care if you jump up. You do whatever you want in my office. It is a safe place. And of course, he was nervous because it was new. So he did vocalize, and he did, do a lot of his impulses. But when he saw I had no reaction whatsoever, about the end of the second time he came down to my office, there was very little of that. In fact, the teacher walked by and thought he had left. And I'm like, nope, he's just hanging out. And he's quiet. So it's not perfect, but if you could take away that stress to control themselves, it's like the teacher was putting so much stress because of her own stress that it just caused it to happen more. It was a vicious cycle. And so then we talked about what to do. And I also gave a lecture to the class about Tourette's, and that everybody has some kind of struggle they're dealing with. And, if they could do me a favor and not react and just ignore it. And after a couple weeks, it wasn't gone, because he might have had a home stressor, he might not have done his homework. Other stressors impact that as well. But on a daily basis, it was cut down by over 50% because all those environmental pressures were gone. And he could think about something else other than his symptomology. So it's kind of a neat thing, really, how our minds work with that kind of stuff. It's very similar to OCD, but different still. Yeah. So what'd you think about either my videos or the films on schizophrenia or Tourette's?
Well, for your story with the lady, I was curious. Now, the government agency had given you permission to tell her that they were monitoring her. But if that wasn't the case and you were told you couldn't tell her that she was being monitored, what would you have done from your position, knowing that her fears are actually valid, but you also can't tell her that they're valid?
So I thought about that, and I would have simply shared it with the psychiatrist, and the psychiatrist would have taken her off medication and re-diagnosed her. But we wouldn't have told her why. Yeah. But what a crazy thing. What else?
One of the things I really liked from the schizophrenia video was the lady like drawing her different voices
Mhm.
and like befriending them and like changing her relationship with them. I just thought that was really fascinating.
I used to have a person come to class, and he would bring all his paintings to class. Most of them were kind of scary though, but we talked about it in class, and he said if he's painting these, he called them all different kinds of demons and everything, but if he painted them, it seemed to give him more control over them. They weren't so scary to him anymore. So it was kind of a way for him to tame his delusional or hallucinatory fears. Yeah, it's more of a hallucination.
And it also reminds me of like narrative therapy because you kind of are externalizing the problem
Yeah,
to develop a different relationship with it. So that's pretty cool.
kind of changing your story. Yeah, nice. Yeah. So, like I said, schizophrenia has always like scared me the most of any diagnoses. But, so as we started talking about diagnoses and you started reading about them, I always remember like the very first time I took a DSM class. And the first thing I thought every time I learned a diagnosis is that I had it. And then as I realized, no, I don't really have this diagnosis, then I started diagnosing my family. So either I had it or a family member had it. So yeah. Uh, and then, I kind of normalized things. And that's when I started dealing more with severity of symptomology and things like that. Schizophrenia is more prevalent than I had realized when I was younger. Because it's not often, like people travel in circles, and it's not often we have a person who's suffering from schizophrenia in our daily circle. They're just in different circles. And so we don't have as much contact with them. But when you begin working in the mental health field, you'll come into contact with a lot of individuals diagnosed with schizophrenia. And you'll realize how common it really is. I might have shared this in the video, but schizophrenia begins between 17 and 24, and symptomology, not enough to make a diagnosis, usually begins at the younger ages of 17 or 18. Here's the weird thing about schizophrenia is that now they believe that people are born with schizophrenia and that it's usually some type of extreme stress that activates that innate gene or trait or whatever is happening. So when you think about what happens at 18, people are moving into adulthood, people go to college, people get a job, people get married, people go to the military at 18. And so many people are triggered and begin to display schizophrenia symptomology when they're in basic training or if they're deployed into some type of conflict. And that's because it's super stressful. So that actually activates it. Yeah. What else? Anything else from last week before we kind of move forward?
I think I thought that video on Surrounds was really interesting
Yeah.
with the camp. I thought that could have been a good and bad thing for the kids that were there. Like on one, it looked like a chaotic environment, was like super crazy and noisy, and like everybody's tics were triggered. But I think it also could be very helpful if they felt accepted and like they're in a space with like-minded kids. So I
They're
thought
not
that,
alone. There's more universality.
so I think it looked both like a dream and a nightmare to the kids that were there.
Yeah.
If I was in that camp, like I have ticks, like I would have went home with 4 new ticks. Like it would have been not good.
So I used to work at a camp, and it was a camp for kids with disabilities, or later they opened it to kids with like serious illnesses. And the whole idea of the camp was that they should be able to go to camp and experience anything the average child would experience at camp. So archery, we had all kinds of like adaptive archery. And we had, camping out in tents for kids with wheelchairs or anything. We had a special camp for kids who are experiencing pain and sickle cell. We had one for kids who are experiencing cancer. And we had special activities for every camp. We had an entire golf course that any disability it accommodated. but with some disabilities, there are also some cognitive disabilities as well. But I think the one thing I experienced at the camp was that most of the kids were the most accepting people I've ever met in my life. That it was probably the first time I truly felt like accepted for who I was. And of course, I accepted them for who they were too. But yeah, they were the most unconditional individuals I had ever met. So, all right. Let's see what's next. All right, so week 3. So this has kind of a continuation of the assessment. I like the mental status exam. It's something when I was younger I memorized because, like, let's say I'm driving along and there's a car accident, or there's somebody walking along the road looking confused. We're obligated to stop and help that person if we're a licensed professional counselor. We can't ignore them. And so I'm like, well, I won't have an assessment sheet with me if something like that happens. And then I started working with the Red Cross, and during times of crisis, mental status exam came in pretty handy. And you don't have to do it exactly, but you want to just kind of memorize the basics, the basic categories, you know. And like some of these, they might lead to an understanding that, okay, there's some type of drug overdose or, a bad trip, or maybe there's, brain damage or a concussion or something like that. So what I normally do is I started out memorizing the big categories, general observation. And I could kind of, guess at most of these things under here. Later on, I memorized them all. Speech, that's an easy one. Mood, perception, thinking processes. So there's a lot under some of these. But if you just memorize, like there's just 12 main categories, and so you just have to memorize 12 things for that one. I'm not going to test you on it, but I just think as a mental health professional, it's a good thing to have in your back pocket. The sad persons inventory, I'm kind of required to give that to you. I don't use it. Because, I mean, a lot of these things aren't exact enough for me. And I think some of them should have like higher points than others, but they just like it because if you memorize what each letter stands for, sad persons, it's easy to remember. That's why it became so popular. But honestly, I would use like Beck's newest version of his depression inventory or, his anxiety inventory. I mean, they're simple too, I just think they're much more accurate, and they're still, they only take 5 minutes to take. So, if I was going to use anything, I'd use those. I think the biggest thing with depression or anxiety is the determination of whether it is environmental or whether it is a chemical imbalance. That's the big determination, because I don't want to give somebody medication if it's environmental. So Butch was talking about this earlier. So the other interesting thing is if you read that book, The Body Keeps the Score, one of the main points in that is that there's so many misdiagnoses for people who have experienced trauma because they may display symptoms of depression. They may display symptoms of anxiety. They may display all kinds of symptomology, but at the core of it, at the root, is some type of trauma. And so it's often this trauma or PTSD is often misdiagnosed as depression or anxiety or even ADHD. So, doing an appropriate differentiation of the diagnosis that may lead to trauma, is really important. So let's see what else. And there's, I also put in my lectures, my notes, and then films on demand. I didn't go through the whole instructions on if the link doesn't work, how to get it in the library, because you did that 10 times last week. So, bipolar, we'll talk more about that after you watch this stuff. So the only thing I don't have an individual lecture on for this coming week is OCD. I have notes on it. I have a film on demand, but I don't have a lecture on it. I'm guessing that's because I mentioned it mixed in with one of my other lectures. It doesn't have its own title for it. But yeah, watch these things, do the discussion board, and then we'll go over each one and highlight different things, and you can ask questions. And yeah. So questions for me about anything. Also, maybe some of you work in some field of mental health or doing an internship or something. If you have any stories you'd like to share, I'd love to hear them during class. Maybe you have some clients. Yeah.
So I work at a school for children who have severe autism. And, what's interesting is the way that the autism is framed to us when we were coming in through our trainings was very similar to OCD, to the point that many of the symptoms were overlapping. And I was even asking, I was like, well, how do I know the difference? And they said, well, it's kind of just more of that social. And if there's a cognitive component, then, we kind of put it towards the autism side. But so many of the students at our school display OCD-like symptoms, where there's a lot of rigidity in their routines. And there's one student that I've been working with who has a lot of prompt dependency. And, so you're trying to help teach them skills of how to accomplish some task, and they don't want to move on to the next step without prompting. And usually you do prompting to help jog, the memory, the behavior, as kind of like a guide, or a modeling even. But this is prompting that's just based on, I don't want to move on until I know that I have your permission, basically. And we're just all scratching our heads. We have behavioral analysts and everybody coming in, and it's been working on it for a long time. We just can't seem to get that, just independence moving. And it's just interesting because of the severe autism, nobody wants to put forth a necessarily diagnosis of something else, but it seems like there could be comorbidity of some kind. And there's not a lot of literature on the comorbidity of severe autism, these other issues, and what that looks like. We got some of the most recent references, and they're saying, well, you could do basically just hands off, give them space, see how long it takes until they just do it. but that causes extreme anxiety and aggressions in the client. So it's like we don't really have the staff or environment to even support that kind of intervention. And then the other one is possibly a differential reward, where they get reward no matter what, whether you prompt or not, for accomplishing a task. But maybe if you just give a bigger reward and a smaller reward, they could start to make a distinction between a slight preference towards more independence. Um, but I just found it interesting that like there's no, and they, even the people who wrote this paper were like, we should really have more research in this, and it's
Yeah.
not there. So it's interesting.
So one thing I found helpful is that I start, rather than prompting, I teach steps. So for instance, they'll say, step one, what's the problem? Step two, and they'll memorize the steps, which is an internal prompt. If they vocalize step one, step two, and recite the step, and each step is general, so they can use it with any problem. It's not problem specific. But, then the last two steps are, what are my choices? Try one out. And then that prompts action. The last one prompts action, but they prompt themselves. Yeah.
Yeah, it's sort of our a lot of our students, like this one in particular, is completely nonverbal. But we do break it down into steps. But when it comes to making choices, a lot of times that tends to agitate them. They just want you
Yeah.
to give it to them.
They freeze. Yeah, they
Unfortunately,
can
yeah,
freeze.
yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah. So it's a lot of studies about autism. Of course, they don't know exactly what causes autism, but just from a lot of the kids I work with, it's like some of them are good at a lot of things. So if it's not severe autism, then it's almost as if, okay, cognitive mapping's good, good, good. Oops, cognitive map broke. Then it's good, good, good. So it's almost like a learning disability, but it's one large area of their cognitive development. And it's almost like somebody erased part of the cognitive map, which is the dendrite mapping. So one way to help that is, behavioral repetition. So, but it doesn't create creativity. It just creates understanding. Yeah. So it is interesting. What else? If you did not post a discussion board post for like week 1, get it done, so I'll give you the points. Maybe at a crisis or something. Post something so I can give you the points. All right, we'll see you all next week. Glad you two came. It's so nice having some company.
Oh, yeah. I'm with you on schizophrenia being super scary, by the way.
It is. That's